This is the Engine Masters carburetor versus the EFI title match round 2. This time, multi-point injection versus a carburetor on the same intake manifold. This is Engine Masters presented by AMSOIL, where way back in episode 2, we did our very first EFI versus carburetor showdown, and we're at it again. But when we did it the first time, we ran it on an LS engine with a carbureted intake manifold, and we used the carburetor versus one of those throttle body self-learning EFI kits. And there was a lot of hardcore guys that were like, no, that's not EFI. Real EFI is multi-point with a custom tune. Well, that's what we're doing here right now with a complete Holley HP setup on top of this small block Chevy. We're gonna compare it to 2 different carburetors. You know, in the meantime, between that early episode and now, I think it's gotten a whole lot easier to run multi-point injection on common engines. Holley sells this entire kit that you can use to convert any 4-barrel based V8 into EFI with a 4-barrel throttle body flowing 1,000 CFM, and you get the rails, the computer, all of the sensors, everything that you need to make the thing run. This thing went on this engine in a snap, and Brule got it all tuned up so that we can compare it to the carburetors. We're running this deal on an Edelbrock Victor Jr. intake manifold. It's a single plane, and it's been modified to accept injectors, although you can buy a manifold like this straight off the shelf now with fuel rails and everything. The engine that we're running this thing on is a small block Chevy that you've seen a bunch on Engine Masters. The last time we had it out, I think we did a water pump shootout, and it made like 460 horsepower. It's a blueprint 383 short block with some hopped up heads and a bigger cam than the crate engine comes with. Very much standard average stuff. You probably have something like this in your car, and we're gonna answer those questions about whether you really wanna step up to multi-point EFI or if you can get away with a carburetor. We're gonna put the thing on the dyno right now, AMSOIL it up, and baseline it with a perfect multi-point EFI tune-up before we throw carburetors on it and answer once and for all, what's really better for power production, EFI or carbs? There's no real rocket science when it comes to oil for EFI versus carburetor, so we're gonna run our little 3D3 on the premium protection 1040 AMSOIL that it's always been on. One thing to think about though is I notice a lot of guys will run carburetors like really rich, and that can lead to oil contamination and shorten up the oil change interval. Whereas if you have EFI, I just poured this all over the valve cover, you can probably extend that oil change interval and save some money. Wow, that's a mess. Now we're heading into our very first test, which is going to be the baseline with EFI on top of the Victor Jr. intake on our 383. Steve's thinking that there's a chance the carburetor is actually going to be very, very close to the EFI, and so when we look at tests where the numbers are just like onesies, twosies here and there as far as horsepower and torque numbers, we'll do 3 runs and average them to remove any anomalies.
That's actually a pretty good run into the little small block.
I've called it many times the ultimate average motor.
It's so average. It's better than average on horsepower.
Dead consistent throughout all the pulls.
Yeah, it's nice, huh?
Yeah. So looking at the average of the last 3 dyno pulls, which basically were identical, I mean, there was almost no wiggle in them at all. Here's our overall curve. We made 474.2 horsepower at 5,700 RPM, and the torque peak is oddly close. It's 5,100 RPM and 462.2 pound-feet. And that's that single plane intake manifold. If it had a dual plane, it'd be making its torque peak a little bit lower. Let's have a look at what you did as far as the AFR curve on this thing. So you're running at 12.5, 12.7, you know, all the way from 3,000 up to the horsepower peak. And we'll see if the carburetor is able to do that too. That's one of the things we see in the carbs. Sometimes they will swing one way or the other.
Yeah, there'll be a jump or a move, and sometimes they'll go lean to rich, rich to lean. There are ways to tune around that, but it takes a pretty special carburetor guy to get that done.
That's you.
But we could probably raise this 2/10, lower it 2/10, and not see any power difference. So I don't know with a carburetor, if it moves 2 or 3/10, how much that matters. 2 or 3 or even 4/10, how much that really matters as far as power.
We keep talking about the carburetor. We need to go install one and find out.
My favorite.
I'm crossing my fingers that they make more peak horsepower.
I think the carburetor might be better everywhere.
You may be right.
Now we have our baseline, but I'm going to give you just a little bit more dirt before we move on about that EFI setup. This manifold right here is part of what comes with a complete Holley HP EFI package that you can buy. It's right around $3,000 for a small block Chevy, whether you've got Vortec or a TPI type cylinder head pattern or the classic pattern. And it comes with everything you need as far as wiring, sensors, computer, manifold, rails, pre-bent lines, the whole shebang. The only thing it doesn't come with is the fuel pump and the injectors themselves, because those things need to be sized towards how much horsepower you're planning on making, so you'll want to buy those separately. And just FYI, we're running 38 pound-per-hour injectors on this deal at 45 PSI. We tried to run a carburetor on this manifold that comes with the Holley kit, and basically it was really bad, which brings up a really good point, which is that multi-point EFI is only flowing dry air through the intake manifold. There's no fuel suspended in it, and that opens up the intake manifold design, and it's really one of the major benefits that we're not realizing here. That's why OE manifolds have big long runners in them that fuel would never make its way through, but dry air will. So we're not realizing those advantages here, but it is a really solid A/B test on how these things are gonna perform on the same manifold, and here's what we're using. On the engine in the dyno cell, we've got a Victor Jr. that's been modified with bungs for injectors. Edelbrock now sells this Victor E manifold, which is very similar, but comes pre-set up for injectors, and they've got rails for it also. And I noticed TrickFlow has a new manifold for small block Fords that you can also buy rails for. And if you've got that situation, you can also buy a Holley kit that does not include the hardware, but that does have everything that you need to put a throttle body and the EFI itself on your engine, just not the hard parts. So there's kind of what we've got going on here. Before we move on here to the old organized fuel leaks, the dinosaur implements known as carburetors. So the 4-barrel throttle body that we were running on the EFI is advertised at 1,000 CFM. So there's two things that I wanted to do in order to compare that to carburetors. One of which is run a 750 CFM carburetor, this one being a Holley XP, because this is really typical as to what a guy would run on the street on that 383 in the real world. But I also wanted to run a carburetor that more accurately was sized to the throttle body we used with the EFI. So this Quick Fuel Technology 4150 series carburetor flows an advertised 1,050 CFM. So that's gonna give us a real accurate A/B test, changing nothing but the air door and the carburetor and the fuel pump. Let's go find out right now what we're gonna do with this 750 before we move on to the 1,050. We have the dyno measuring the manifold air temperature, which is going to be really interesting. I want to see if it's colder with the carburetor.
We've got a temperature probe right here. And kind of what we're looking for there is the difference in the vaporization of the fuel with the carburetor to see if it actually lowers the air inlet temperature significantly.
Any predictions here, Freiberger?
I don't think the 750 is going to make more power than the EFI.
You don't?
No.
You want to rethink that?
I love knowing and watching.
I know, I hate it when you know. Brule already pre-tuned all this stuff so that we would be set and be able to do this quickly.
So this is really streamlined, right?
Yeah, look how much lower that is than the carburetor. It's an advantage for hood clearance.
And notice there's no booster venturi inside there to obstruct airflow.
Yeah, that's 1,000 CFM. This is 750 with a booster and junk in the way.
But basically we just took this off and put that on. It changed nothing else but the fuel pressure.
Nothing else. Even the ignition timing still being handled by the Holley EFI. So the only change is the carburetor and the fuel pressure. Okay, now we have the Holley 750 double pumper on there, 4-barrel carburetor, and we're gonna see what happens. I bet it probably makes 2 or 3 numbers at peak and the rest is the same. That's my guess.
Oh, you think it's going to make more power? With the carb's way smaller than the throttle body, though.
Yeah.
It is a lot smaller.
But,
yeah, I think it's going to make less.
But does the engine even need the CFM that the throttle body offers? So we'll find out. Once again, we're gonna do 3 pulls. Steve has already pre-tuned this thing to be as close to the EFI as he could get it, but the thing is, carburetor tends to still go through a bigger range of air-fuel ratios throughout the pull. As you can see right here, this red line is the EFI, the black one is the carburetor, and a lot of this has to do, I think, with loading the carburetor at 2,500 RPM at full load, wide open throttle on the dyno. It doesn't like to actually move a fuel at that point.
It has trouble metering it through the booster and having a good signal.
Well, and the fuel has inertia that needs to be overcome. Whereas on the EFI, it's being sprayed right at the back of the intake valve. This thing, the fuel droplet has to accelerate through the intake manifold.
Right, it has to be drawn in all the way from the float bowl down into the cylinder.
Yeah. And here's our 3rd pull. Too close to call at this point.
I don't know where it's going to happen.
Gotta run the averages. So what we're looking at is 471.7 average horsepower at 5,700 RPM and at 5,000 RPM, 463.9 pound-feet of torque. Let's overlay the EFI and see how they compare. So the EFI being the red line.
It makes less torque.
And the carburetor actually improving here, but arguably, is that because the carburetor is richer right there than the EFI?
Let's take a look.
Here, once again, we're looking at the red line is the air-fuel ratio curve over the pull with the EFI, and the black one is the carburetor. And the carburetor is making more power, not just here at 3,200, where we're seeing that it's way richer than the EFI, but it's also making more power up here. So
yeah, and there really wasn't much I could do about that swing, and I'm not sure there would be if I worked on it for days.
Yeah.
But with, I kind of just looked at where we were with the EFI, and I mean, it was rich here, lean here, but then out here it was basically the same. But I just didn't, that's really all I could do there. It's on both sides.
Yeah, normally I think what we would expect to see is that the carburetor, because of the latent heat of vaporization of the fuel in the manifold, has a colder manifold air temp than the EFI and makes more power. That's the typical theory, right?
Speaking of air temp, let's take a look.
So this is going to be air temp inside the intake manifold, just under the throttle body. And look at that.
40 degrees.
89 degrees down to 80 degrees with the throttle body, and it is 40 degrees colder. It's actually approaching freezing with the carburetor. It's 37 degrees.
That probe is just below the butterfly.
Yeah, it is exactly there.
If we're down in the plenum, it might have a slight temperature change, but that's showing what a carburetor really does when it atomizes fuel.
And that's why in some race applications, they put fuel injectors up higher in the manifold so that it's cooling the charge throughout the runner and everything. That is a dramatic example of internet theory proven.
Yeah.
The carburetor does have cooler inlet track temperature than the EFI.
This is the right carburetor for this engine. It's not oversized to try and prove a point. I mean, that's the right carburetor. I'm just amazed at how close they really are at wide open.
The next thing we're going to do, though, is go to the 1,000 CFM carburetor, which is going to be closer to the airflow of the EFI, and we'll find out if it still makes more power down here, but also beats it up top.
If it needed the air, but the other challenge we may have is 2,500 RPM with a 1050, 4150 carburetors.
Yeah.
No, it'll be fine, Steve-O. Trust me.
It's all good.
Trust me, it's no problem.
I always trust you, Steve.
So the answer here with the 750 carb versus the EFI is that the carburetor really wins from 3,300 RPM all the way up to 5,000, and the EFI is matching it and even beating it by a number or two at the very, very top of the range. And either way, it's not significant enough to make a difference to your life.
It's, you know, we're talking a total difference of 6 pound-feet. And when it comes to horsepower, geez, it's like
5, 4.5.
Yeah.
Let's go put the 1,000 on there.
Let's do that and find out.
Yeah, I want to do that. So this is the EFI throttle body. The air doors or butterflies or throttle blades in this thing are the same diameter as what's in that carburetor right there. This is advertised at 1,000 CFM. The thing is, so is this carburetor. Well, actually, this is advertised at 1,050, but it's got boosters in the way. So they don't flow exactly the same, but both of them are gonna be far in excess of what this engine actually needs.
I know, it's ridiculous.
It's gonna be interesting.
Can you go work the throttle leveler in there so I like something about to run little errands like that.
1,050 CFM. This is Dulcich's last hope for the carburetor making better peak horsepower.
Oh, I mean, it's almost certain that it will.
It's supposed to.
Okay, let's do it. Once again, 3 runs, we're gonna average them. Here goes number 1.
Pretty stout.
Carbs way better. We're seeing bigger torque numbers at peak and 480 horsepower for the first time, but we got one more pull before we can do our average. Carburetor wins peak power.
Carburetor wins.
Everywhere?
Period.
Flat out?
Flat out. Now maybe what we're seeing is CFM to CFM comparison, but the advantages of the cooler air.
Oh, yes.
Oh, what is the air temp? Let's have a look. 36 degrees in the intake manifold. So now the results of 3 pulls on average with the 1,050 CFM carburetor. 469.8 pound-feet of torque and 480.2 horsepower. By far the biggest number that we've seen. Go ahead and overlay that with the EFI. Oh! Carburetor dominates in black versus the EFI in red. Now down here we've got our total fuel flow, and you might say, well, that's not equal. Well, the deal is when you make less power, you use less fuel. At the end of the last test with the 750 carb, you emphatically stated this is the right carburetor for this engine. Well, do you revise that?
You know, I honestly, I've seen guys who run on a small block of 750 and then a 950 or 1,000 or something. And at the track, they didn't respond as well. Now, this thing feels like it drives really well on the dyno.
On the dyno.
But I'm thinking that
I still
maybe
think it doesn't
at
drive
the track,
as good.
maybe it's a situation where it runs another mile an hour, but loses a couple hundredths or, you know.
Because it won't accelerate as hard.
Yeah, because it's just, it's not metering the fuel as well in that lower RPM range. But here at wide open throttle, I mean, if a guy had enough converter, I suppose it would.
Yeah, that's pretty definitive though, really, when you look at the divergence of those curves. The carburetor trumps the EFI on this particular engine combination pretty much everywhere.
A guy's gonna have to look at it and weigh the obvious downsides of the carburetor, which I will fill you in on as soon as we go wrap this whole show up.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Okay, Dulcich, let me have it.
What? I already know where this is going. It's a setup. You want to make me a knuckle-dragging Neanderthal who doesn't like fuel injection at all. So let's just get that out of the way and we'll get down to brass tacks on why one may be better than the other.
Well, the carburetor made more power. No question.
Is there any other criteria you'd like to discuss? Or do we just end it right there?
Well, I think every other criteria is stuff that we have to just sort of estimate because you can't test it on the dyno.
Right.
I think the EFI is going to be superior in drivability if it's got any kind of a decent tune-up in it, especially compared to what most guys do with their carburetors, which is take it out of the box, plop it on, and drive it and blow black smoke and go, it's way better than EFI. You know, I think a guy who actually goes and has his EFI tuned is going to have a better overall performing car than the typical guy who doesn't tune his carburetor.
Well, I'll tell you where I think it's a slam dunk to have EFI. Boosted applications with a turbo or a centrifugal blower, or let's say something like autocross or off-road where you're sloshing fuel around in the bowl and it floods out and coughs and sputters and makes you lose races.
Here's like the really bad news though. I added up all the prices of everything that we actually used in this test, including like considering a fuel pump and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It costs like $2,500 to $3,000 more to have the EFI than the carburetor setups that we used.
Well, those kind of numbers make me convinced that it's probably not the right induction system for this kind of a motor, because that's about half the cost of the entire package sitting right up here at the top.
I would say that there's pro touring guys who, even on a 383 like this, want to have the smooth throttle response and no carburetor sloshing and just the cool factor of having EFI. But I agree with you, the real advantage of this deal is definitely going to be on boost or on higher performing applications than this, or for anybody who's a tech geek and wants the extra features of the EFI like data logging, nitrous control, boost control, AC idle up, gauges, all of that stuff that you just don't get when you only buy a carburetor.
Oh no, you get all the doodads with all the wiring, that's for sure. And it's not always about value. Like you said, you might just be a tech guy and you just want to dial stuff in on your computer.
Yeah,
and
I'm into it. I would totally do it. As a matter of fact, do you know what I want to do with this package?
Put it on my car and tune it up for me?
Pro Charger.
Oh, that would be even better.
Pro Charger is going to make it really good. Maybe if we get around to that someday, you'll see it on Engine Masters presented by AMSOIL. The EFI is actually pretty good.
Yeah, I like it.
You do?
Yeah.
What? He said it. He actually said it. I didn't think you'd ever actually admit it.
It's just all this.
Oh, there's all those wires.
All
though.
that Pisgetti up there.
Conclusion, take one, ABC mark. Good, Chris? Yep. Marker. It's like it's off.